Downtown Dallas, the day President Kennedy is assassinated. Dealey Plaza, where's the crowd? Downtown at a different point, and at another location around Dallas. And yet another. Dealey Plaza. Another location in Dallas. Dealey Plaza, where's the crowd? Another spot downtown. Dealey Plaza. Where'd the crowd go? Another spot along the route. Two more spots in downtown Dallas. Dealey Plaza. Where's the crowd? A crowd even along the freeway. So why are there no crowds here in Dealey Plaza on this beautiful day? I learned why because witnesses Gene Hill and Mary Mormon, who were in that grassy area, were only there after flirting with a Dallas traffic cop who allowed them special entry, because Dallas traffic cops had closed this area to the public, because any crowd there would have blocked the line of sight aim of the cop with the rifle in the Commerce Street pedestrian tunnel who would assassinate the president if Oswald missed.
This video is like no other JFK assassination video you've ever seen, because for the first time you'll see the reality of how the shooting was actually carried out. I discovered this 2 years ago, not because I'm so intelligent or talented, because I'm not. I discovered this simply because I'm red-green colorblind.
Why would that matter? Because I, like one of only 1% of American men and virtually no American women, or one of only every 200 Americans, have a color blindness called deuteranopia. So while I can't see many colors and shades virtually everyone else can, I can see subtle shapes and patterns that 99.5% of cannot. Pictured here are two color test plates with a number in each. In those, if you see a 74 and a 5, you have normal color vision. I, however, see a 21 and a 2. This matters because in a super enlarged high-definition photo I purchased from Getty Images, taken by UPI photographer Frank Cancelleri 20 seconds after the fatal shot struck President Kennedy, in the third portal of the pedestrian tunnel that runs under the infamous triple underpass, I can see the unmistakable image of a man in flight.
I'm actually telling you I can see President Kennedy's actual assassin. I'm not clairvoyant and I'm not crazy. I'm just colorblind. Before beginning with part one, I'd like you to understand my actual motivation. I'm not doing this for money. I'm not writing a book. In fact, in the 2 years since I first discovered this image, it has brought me nothing but frustration, misery, and humiliation because everybody thinks I'm crazy. I'm doing this because I am just so tired of listening to all these arrogant JFK experts who are so full of crap when it comes to how the shooting of the president actually occurred. They don't know what they're talking about.
The shooting ambush of President Kennedy was ingeniously planned. That's why it's taken 62 years to solve, so it will require your full attention to the following to understand. That will be presented in a number of episodes to include the direct involvement in the murder by several Dallas traffic cops and senior officers who modified the motorcade route, set up an unnecessary roadblock, and prohibited pedestrians on the grass in Dealey Plaza to create a nearly perfect killing zone ambush for the president, as well as facilitating the escape of the second assassin and lying under oath before the Warren Commission, as well as concealing vital information. And later, in great detail, we'll examine the Cancelleri photo in both original and heavily enhanced versions. I hope will enable you to see the assassin, as well as several very poor quality but important images taken by two other photographers showing the second assassin's part. And now a very brief overview of how the ambush was carried out. There were 5 shots. 2 from the second assassin in the pedestrian tunnel under the triple underpass, and that smoke and an explosive report from the grassy knoll did in fact take place, but were not a gunshot, but a pyrotechnic diversion meant to allow the second assassin's escape. This steel utility closet is where the rifle was hidden both before and after the assassination, and from where the second assassin fired the second shot which struck the president in the throat and exited his back, and the 5th and final headshot. and from where that assassin was able to escape.
And how this was made possible by crowds and police converging on the grassy knoll and on the Texas School Book Depository and ignoring the Commerce Street Arcade.
Let's begin at the east end of the Commerce Street Arcade. From that location would be an unobstructed field of fire which looks exactly up Elm Street. So as the president approached, his head would move neither to the left or right in the assassin's sight. And with its large steel door and the shooter between them, it would have made a perfect rifle rest and virtual invisibility from three directions and good cover from the fourth, while the traffic cop on the west side of the underpass and cop at the roadblock on Main Street could ensure the assassin's escape while also blocking off Main Street, provided an unobstructed killing zone for the assassin. Then after the final shot, the shooter would hand the rifle off to the spotter getaway man, who would quickly lock the weapon in the closet while the shooter fled to the west, and the rifle could be picked up in a few days. The Dallas police would also immediately release all stopped traffic onto Elm and Main Streets to create confusion to allow the second assassin's escape and the murder of Oswald. But something went wrong. In episode 2, we'll begin with a detailed examination of the ambush, starting with the events in Dealey Plaza before and including the first shot. Episode number 2, the ambulance diversion, the first shot from the Texas School Book Depository 6th floor, and why he missed.
First major diversion, the arrival of the ambulance at
1219 at 100 Houston Street, as seen here in the actual police radio.
Ostensibly, the ambulance was called to this location to pick up a person suffering an epileptic seizure. However, we know this is a false call because according to ambulance driver Aubrey Wright, he and other drivers on other shifts had been called to this very location on up to a dozen false calls in the days leading up to the assassination.
This allowed the second shooter to get in place,
while everyone else in Dealey Plaza was distracted by the arrival of the ambulance. It also allowed the plotters in the days leading up to the assassination to practice and refine their plan,
which was for Oswald to shoot the president immediately after the limousine turned onto the center lane of Elm Street. Should Oswald fail to kill the president, the signalman would signal for additional shots and for the grassy knoll man to make the fire diversion. Had the first shots been fatal, there would have been no diversion, and the police would have converged only on the book depository to kill Oswald in an open and shut case. This also explains why Oswald didn't kill the president with the very easy shot as he approached on Houston Street, as is seen in this FBI recreation. The plotters had doubtlessly already told Oswald there would be a diversion on the grassy knoll designed to allow his escape. So Oswald had to wait until the president's limousine turned west onto Elm Street off of Houston. For if Oswald took the easy shot while the president was still moving north on Houston Street, the grassy knoll diversion would have been well around the corner and far down the hill and would have deceived no one, thus making it impossible for Oswald to escape, while in reality, the plotters always intended him to be the patsy. A very dead patsy. I'll begin with the shot from the 6th floor of the book depository.
Kennedy's limousine was now almost directly straight down. We know this because witnesses in front of the school book depository tell us that the limousine made the turn so wide it nearly hit the curb at the corner of Elm and Houston.
As we see in this photo, the sniper's nest is very cramped. So Oswald, who was following the president through his rifle scope, would have unexpectedly lost sight of his target as the president's limousine went further to the north than expected and out of sight almost vertically below. Oswald, now in a panic, must hurriedly reacquire the president through his scope, and thus rushes his first shot and misses, striking the pavement to the rear of the limousine, as seen by one of the railroad workers, one policeman, and several curbside witnesses. Though the plotters had been carefully practicing the assassination, they probably had been using a full-size luxury car like another Lincoln or a Cadillac and they didn't take into account the extra length of the president's limousine. It was 3.5 feet longer than a stock Lincoln Continental, and thus not only had the wheelbase of a delivery truck, but also the turning radius of a delivery truck. So Oswald, who had positioned himself to shoot the president when the car turned into the center lane, was completely unprepared and unable to adjust when the limousine went out of sight into the northernmost lane. This picture above shows not only the extreme shot angle, but with the distance of only about 100 feet, that to miss this easy shot demonstrates the shooter was probably an amateur like Oswald and not a professional assassin who under pressure would have adjusted and made the shot. In episode 3, we'll examine the second shot and the first by the Commerce Street tunnel shooter, proof that it penetrated the front windshield, and why the president was never hit from behind with any shots. Here in episode 3, we'll destroy the myth of the president's having been hit in the back, how he was actually shot from the front, and why a failure to account for the elevated position of his right arm has led to years of nonsense. The second shot, and the first from the shooter in the Commerce Street pedestrian tunnel,
penetrated the limousine's windshield and struck the president in the throat, entering under his knot in his tie and exiting his back about 2 inches to the right of his spine. That shot was fired over the open utility cabinet door inside the pedestrian arcade. The shot passed to the limousine.
Starting with the view taken from Oswald's 6th floor firing position and superimposing a blue shaping for the president's limousine onto Elm Street, we see how perfectly a shot path from the pedestrian tunnel would puncture the windshield and strike the president in the throat.
After exiting the president's back, the bullet would have either hit the street or bounced harmlessly off the Daltex building. In this famous Elchin's photograph taken about 2 seconds after the shot, we see where the bullet strikes the window, and in a close-up view we see where the bullet actually has penetrated through and through the window.
We know this was a bullet hole because it was seen by 2 Dallas policemen, Officer Stavis Ellis, who actually recalled putting a pencil into the hole, and Officer H.R. Freeman, who observed the limousine at Parkland Hospital and stated, "I was right beside it. I could have touched it. It was a bullet hole." Dr. Evelia Glangis, a medical student at the rear of Parkland Hospital near the emergency room exit where the limousine was parked, saw the hole and said to friends, "Look, there's a bullet hole in the windshield." Dr. Glangis also stated that she had been around guns since her childhood and that the hole was a front to back, through and through bullet hole. St. Louis Post-Dispatch reporter Richard Dudman saw the hole close up at Parkland Hospital before he was shoved away by a Secret Service agent. After the limousine had been flown back to Washington, the hole was also seen by Secret Service agent Joe Palello, who was guarding it in the White House garage. And finally, on November the 25th, the day of the president's funeral, by George Whitaker of the Ford Motor Company, who actually replaced the windshield of the limousine at the River Rouge plant. He said the hole was 4 to 6 inches to the driver's side of the car from the rear view mirror. Whitaker, with 40 years experience working with automotive glass, said that the hole entered from the front toward the rear. Please also note how low in the windshield the rear view mirror is mounted.
We see here the president reacting to being struck in the throat, and you can clearly see his left fist being risen to his chin,
making this hole in his dress shirt.
In this image, we see how the bullet entered through the windshield, passed between Governor Connally and his wife to strike the president in the throat and exit about 2 inches to the right of his spine. Please note that Governor Connally was sitting about 4 to 6 inches lower than the president, as you can clearly see, and in the second photo, there is a much greater distance between the two men than the previous diagram would indicate.
In addition, 3 tiny glass particles from the bullet hole in the windshield punctured President Kennedy's right cheek, as discovered by Gawler Funeral Home mortician Edwin Strobel, who, as one of the morticians preparing the body for burial after the autopsy, discovered and plugged the 3 holes which were leaking embalming fluid.
In this FBI recreation, we see that with the very steep slope of Elm Street, that the bullet from the Commerce Street arcade would line up perfectly with both the windshield and the FBI agent posing as Mr. Kennedy.
Because I don't recall seeing either a still photograph or a film of Dealey Plaza which adequately conveys just how dramatically Elm Street slopes down, I took this video from atop the triple underpass to give the viewer a sense of just how steep the street really is. And in this diagram, please note the slope of Elm Street vis-a-vis the president and his limousine. We can establish that one bullet made both the wound in President Kennedy's neck and in his back because as it transited the body, it made a bruise on top of the right lung. However, as no bullets were found inside the body, it could only be a single bullet that entered and exited. As the bullet was probably of an armor-piercing variety, it made a perfect hole through the front windshield, then traveled under the knot in the president's tie to make a perfectly round entry wound in the president's neck, as observed by the physicians at Parkland Hospital. However, it's later noted that the autopsy at Bethesda Hospital, upon exiting the back, the bullet made an oblong wound.
We know it was a windshield through and through shot, and we know where it hit him, just under his tie. If you were poked in the throat with someone's finger or a bullet, you would go like this. Your muscles would contract toward it. If, however, you were punched or shot between the shoulder blades, you would react like that. Can you remember when someone has put ice down your neck as a joke sometimes? You don't pull forward. You pull back because it's painful. If he had been shot in the back, he would have pulled back, but he didn't. He pulled forward.
Here in the Zapruder film, the president reflexively reacts forward after being shot from the front. On the left, we see the perfectly round entry hole in the president's throat as seen by the doctors at Parkland Hospital.
On the right, we see that same entry wound after a small incision was cut across it in order to insert a tracheotomy tube. When the president's body left Parkland Hospital, the wound looked like the image on the right.
However, later, in this photo taken prior to the autopsy at Bethesda Hospital, the wound had been gouged open.
Dr. Malcolm Perry, after stating at a news conference after the president's death at Parkland Hospital that the wound in the throat was an entry wound, Dr. Perry was threatened by a Secret Service agent yet to never call that wound an entry wound again,
if he knew what was good for him.
Here we see the wound on the president's back on the actual autopsy sheet, Bethesda Naval Hospital. Misidentifies as an entry wound instead of an exit wound because they had been informed by both the Secret Service that the president had been shot
from above and behind,
to later be altered in the Warren Commission report by Warren Commission member Gerald Ford, who elevated the wound 5 inches in order to make magic bullet theory plausible. Doctors Humes and Boswell, both Navy commanders, and Pierre Fink,
an Army lieutenant colonel,
tried to probe the back wound with a medical probe to trace the bullet track, but were unable to trace that bullet path to a depth of no more than 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. This is because, as you can see
in Zapruder frame number 198, just before the president goes behind the Stemmons Freeway sign and is struck in the throat, he has his arm up waving. Note the white cuff of his shirt, thus lifting the trapezius, scapula, and other scapular muscles, allowing the bullet to pass inside and underneath the scapula. Thus, when the body was placed on an autopsy table, the scapula and the scapular muscles descended to close and hide the bullet track. Here we again see where the pathologist had located that back wound. By moving that back wound onto an anatomical drawing, we can see why the pathologist could not probe either the wound or its bullet track to a depth of more than 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch. They were striking the scapula in its normal resting position. However, recall the president had his elbow up, thus lifting the scapula, as can be seen in this anatomical representation. Thus, when the president was shot in the throat, the bullet had transited through his chest, bruised the top of his right lung, and exited underneath the now uplifted scapula. Thus, with the president's body in a supine position on an autopsy table, the scapula would have been lowered into its normal resting position to completely cover and hide the bullet track. And this shot could only come from the Commerce Street arcade, as it made a tiny nick on the left side of the knot of the president's tie. Had it come from the infamous grassy knoll, the shot would have had to go through the center of the knot in the tie to make the entry wound in his throat, and then make an impossible left turn to exit his back. Before moving on to the third shot, I'd like to demonstrate how honest witnesses can perpetuate false and misleading statements, which are the opposite of what really happened. In this Altgens photograph, please note the driver of the backup vehicle, Special Agent Kinney, and how he's looking directly at President Kennedy. Agent Kinney later testified that he saw the shot hit the president in the back. But did he really? Agent Kinney really didn't see a bullet hit the president at all. What he did see was a hole appear in the back of the president's coat. So why did he say he saw the bullet hit the president in the back? Because within minutes of the actual shooting, Kinney and other agents then at Parkland Hospital would be informed that the shot had come from above and behind the president, so it would be perfectly natural for Kinney's mind to unconsciously assume the hole he saw appear was made by a bullet from behind. So Kinney wasn't lying, but neither was he telling the truth. We'll see this again later when we examine the infamous shot from the grassy knoll. In episode 4, we'll examine the third shot, how it accounts for the dent in the windshield trim and Governor Connolly's wounds, and the fourth shot that completely missed, struck the curb and slightly wounded bystander James Tague. Episode 4. The third shot hits Governor Connolly, and the fourth shot that slightly wounds bystander James Tague. The third shot.
The sixth floor shooter must now shoot down through the trees, as seen in this FBI recreation.
The bullet hits a branch, tumbles, and fragments,
Hitting Governor Connolly,
while multiple pieces of the bullet's outer shattered copper jacket were flung off the spinning missile toward the front windshield of the car, while the largest interior part of the missile continued to tumble by to strike Governor Connolly in the back. We know it was tumbling because
it has an oblong shape as it penetrates Connolly's shirt. Because it hit the tree and fragmented, one fragment hitting the inside windshield trim. As shown here, we see that it did heavily dent the window trim, and the fragment was later found on the front floor of the car. From the front of the car, we see 3 more smaller fragment fractures that were made on the inside of the window. Again, the bullet hole was through and through. These 3 fragments were part of the third bullet that fragmented and tumbled and damaged only the inside. Here we see a 6.5 millimeter round taken from Oswald's rifle. Please notice the unusual length of the bullet, which is copper jacketed. Fairly typical example of how a copper jacketed bullet is constructed, and we see examples of what happens to that copper jacket when the bullet strikes something hard like a branch. And if the bullet then tumbles, how small pieces of the jacket are then spun off, making the 4 defects shown here, of which numbers 1, 2, and 4 are in the glass on the inside, and defect number 3 is the large dent in the window trim. The fourth shot and the 6th floor shooter's third misses Kennedy completely and hits the curb on Main Street, and the bullet fragments, and either fragments of the bullet or chips off of the curb, hit Mr. Tague in the cheek. Here we see, as indicated by the green arrow, where the shooter has struck the curb,
and at the blue arrow where bullet or curb chips struck Tague in the face. This fourth shot, the 6th floor shooter's third and final, made for a perfect record of missing President Kennedy with all 3. Clearly, this was not the work of a professional assassin. In the 5th episode to come, we'll examine the role of the infamous Umbrella Man and the 5th and final fatal shot which struck the president. Here in episode 5, we'll examine the Umbrella Man, the 5th and final shot, and why the existence of the infamous grassy knoll shooter, which is held sacrosanct by nearly all JFK experts, has done more to prevent the solution of the crime than the FBI, the CIA, and the Secret Service put together, was nothing more than a clever diversion with a 2-bit firecracker. The Umbrella Man was, along with his spotter, the Signal Man. The reason there are two is for instantaneous communication. First, by having the man with the upraised arm shown above with the blue arrow, he could stand in the street with an unobstructed view of the president approaching. Second, by having the Umbrella Man behind him on higher ground, who would simply mirror his actions, he is far more easily seen by the sniper spotter team member in the pedestrian tunnel. For as the plotters had no way of knowing how large the crowd would be on the north side of Elm Street, they needed a marker, like the umbrella, that could be easily seen. For the sniper spotter had to be able to instantaneously advise the second assassin as whether to shoot or not, as the sniper would have been concentrating solely on the president. The man with his arm elevated would keep it elevated until the president was fatally hit, which would be mirrored by the Umbrella Man. And if the umbrella were still elevated, this would signal the man on the grassy knoll to make a diversion and the second assassin that the president was still alive and more shots were needed. And here we have the Umbrella Man and his partner demonstrating how to be incredibly conspicuous by trying to be overly inconspicuous. Pandemonium reigns all through Daley Plaza, and yet these two look like they've just sat down for a spot of tea. And here the spotter watches everyone run up grassy knoll and displays zero curiosity. And he has a fascinating sense of style. Yes, he's not the first guy to have a radio with rabbit ears in his back pocket, but inside his coat? The fifth and fatal headshot, and the second fired from the Commerce Street arcade.
The shooter is at this location. Now this is very important because we see at the time of the fatal shot, this is where Mr. Kennedy is at. And what is more important is the attitude of Mr. Kennedy's head, that is to say, which way his head is turned. Now this is the location where the red arrow is of our actual shooter at the Commerce Street arcade opening. This is extremely important because only these angles make the wounds on Mr. Kennedy's head line up. And according to the calculations done by NASA Space Division engineer Thomas Canning, award-winning computer animator Dale Myers, whose work was reviewed and confirmed by the Z-Axis Corporation, the president's head was turned about 26 degrees to the southwest from his line of track. And we see the shot angle is consistent with striking the president in the temple. We know that the fatal headshot hit President Kennedy in the temple for several reasons. The first of these was the observation of the Parkland emergency physicians that they relayed to Assistant Press Secretary Malcolm Kilduff, who is seen here during an emergency press conference given immediately after the president's death, where Kilduff points to his own temple, indicating the entry wound. One of those emergency room physicians who saw the president's head wound from probably less than 2 feet away was Dr. Charles Crenshaw, indicating the location of the entry wound. And here we see Mr. Bill Newman pointing to his temple to indicate where the president was struck. Mr. Newman, along with his wife Gail and their 2 children, were the closest witnesses to the president when he was struck by the fatal headshot. In addition, Dr. Jim Jenkins, as a young Navy corpsman at Bethesda Hospital, he assisted at the actual autopsy of the president and saw that the entry wound was in the president's right temple.
And finally, Gawler Funeral Home mortician Tom Robinson, seen here in a Dutch documentary years later, describes a skull puncture hidden just inside the hairline above the temple, which he describes about a 1/4 inch in size. Please note that 1/4 inch or 0.250 inches would roughly correspond to the then newly introduced M16 round at 2.23 inches in diameter.
See the president, same position just before the fatal headshot, looking to the southwest. The bullet strikes him high in the temple, his right side, and exits on the right rear of his head, making a massive wound as seen by all of the Dallas doctors,
as well as by mortician Tom Robinson, who prepared the body after the autopsy and actually used a large piece of rubber to plug the hole. Oddly, the Warren Commission called none of these morticians as witnesses. By the way, for those of you who put a lot of faith in the U.S. government, this drawing of the supposed autopsy photo of the president's head showing the wounds there is still the official position of the United States government.
The grassy knoll shot was impossible because the angles are all wrong. If the shot were from the grassy knoll and hit Mr. Kennedy in the temple, it would have blown out most of the left side of his head. To illustrate this, we set up a mannequin in a mock Dealey Plaza set to scale with the mannequin head at 26 degrees to the direction of the travel of the limousine. From that scaled out position, we then fired 2 rounds, one from a 30-06 bolt action rifle and one from an AR-15 rifle.
Here we can see the entry point of the AR-15 round, and here we can see our test 30-06 round. However, when I take the mannequin head and turn it, we see our 30-06 exit and our AR-15 exit. In other words, they transited the head in a straight line. However, the doctors at Parkland saw a massive head wound like this coloration on the right rear of the head, and the bullet ended here.
From the grassy knoll, it would have had to have made an impossible 90-degree turn.
We're looking at Mr. Kennedy from the northwest, and that would have been the general direction which the shot from the grassy knoll would have come from, southeast. That's inconsistent with the actual wound, which blows out the right rear of Mr. Kennedy's head,
As seen by the Parkland doctors.
to allow for the slope of Elm Street. Now we see the path of the fatal bullet. Fired from the Commerce Street arcade, goes over the windshield, under the crossbar, and strikes President Kennedy in the right temple. In the next photo, we see that the president was indeed seated quite high in the automobile. And in this final photo, recreation of the crime, showing the slope of Dealey Plaza, the yellow line clearly demonstrates that the president's head would have been higher than the front windshield. This is the approximate location. A gunshot with a loud report, a very bright flash, and much that it's still hanging in the air some seconds later as photographed here. Modern ammunition simply doesn't do this. That's why its gunpowder is called smokeless powder.
James Tague, who was standing on the north curb of Commerce Street, directly facing the fence on the grassy knoll. Mr. Tague testified, "About this time, I heard what sounded like a firecracker. Well, a very loud firecracker. It certainly didn't sound like a rifle shot. It was more like of a loud cannon-type sound. I looked around to see who was throwing firecrackers or what was going on." And then there's Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman explains how, after hearing the shots, he ran across Dealey Plaza to the area of the grassy knoll where a railroad yardman told him. He said he thought he saw somebody throw something through a bush. I think that railroad yardman saw somebody throw a firecracker. That this was a firecracker is supported by Railroad Supervisor Sam Holland, seen above here on the Triple Underpass, who testified before the Warren Commission. There was a shot, a report. I don't know whether it was a shot, can't say that. And a puff of smoke came out about 6 or 8 feet above the ground right from under those trees. And at just about the location from where I was standing, you could see that puff of smoke, like someone had thrown a firecracker or something out, and it was just about the way it sounded. It wasn't as loud as the previous reports or shots. Ironically, in the 1967 documentary on the assassination titled Rush to Judgment, Holland is put forth as one of the single most important witnesses for the existence of the shot from the grassy knoll, this being an almost exact contravention of his Warren Commission testimony 3 years earlier. So like Special Agent Kenny's having seen the president shot in the back, Sam Holland has likewise been influenced by the narrative from others, and so his testimony goes from uncertainty to seeing a shot from the grassy knoll, when in reality it was a lousy firecracker. This is the famous photo taken by Miriam Moorman near the instant of the fatal headshot. The grassy knoll fence is in the background. This is Marilyn Sitzman. As a young employee of Abraham Zapruder, she can be seen in this enhanced version of that photograph standing behind to steady Zapruder as he takes his famous film. In this position, the corner of the infamous fence is only about 35 feet away, and yet This young, healthy woman not only sees no shooter at the fence, she never even heard any report from that location. It's because the report that was heard by others was from a firecracker thrown over and outside the fence to the south. Thus, the sound waves from that device were blocked from her location to the north. That brings me to the most credible of all ear witness testimony of the sounds of Dealey Plaza during the assassination. Mr. Robert Davison, seen here, where he witnessed the murder from atop the triple underpass.
I particularly did not hear the shot that did kill Kennedy, because the Kennedy car was surrounded. There were 7 motorcycles and all going boom, 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 because they were going at a relatively slow speed, and there was so much noise by those motorcycles that I never heard a shot.
Robert is correct. There were 7 Harley-Davidson motorcycles, 3 of them out in front as seen here, and 4, 2 each along each rear fender of the presidential limousine.
I did, however, when the final shot was made on Kennedy, I did see a great big puff of smoke coming from the bushes behind the grassy knoll.
So once again, we hear testimony from a very credible witness about a very large puff of smoke, but again without a corresponding simultaneous rifle report. The reason for that is simple. There wasn't one, only the pop of a firecracker. Also, please note, the reason for the smoke and flash diversion was to pull everyone's attention to the grassy knoll and away from the second assassin's actual location. Everyone converges on the grassy knoll and completely ignores the actual assassin at Commerce Street. Beginning with Lee Bowers, I'll demonstrate why there was too much smoke seen for it to have come from a modern rifle.
Lee Bowers was located in a railroad control tower approximately 270 feet behind the grassy knoll. That's what Lee Bowers had to say about what he saw. There was a flash of light or something I couldn't identify. Some unusual occurrence. A flash, light, or smoke, or something which caused me to feel something out of the ordinary had occurred there. We've designed a scaled-out experiment, and from 270 feet, we will fire a .30-06 rifle, an AR-15 rifle, and then a pyrotechnic device.
Fire in the hole, 30-06. Fire in the hole, AR.
Pyrotechnic.
I'd like to stay with Lee Bowers for a moment, but I'd like to zoom in to roughly half that distance and let you watch the sequence again of the 2 rifle muzzle flashes as compared to the pyrotechnic detonation.
Fire in the hole, 30-06. Fire in the hole, AR.
Pyrotechnic.
Next, we'll return to those witnesses standing on top of the triple underpass,
approximately 120 to 125 feet from where they saw smoke come out from under the trees from behind the fence on the grassy knoll. As these are the most cited witnesses for the possibility of a gunman on the grassy knoll, from a distance of 120 feet, we will test a .30-06 rifle, an AR-15 rifle, and a pyrotechnic.
Fire in the hole, 30-06. Fire in the hole, AR.
And the pyrotechnic. Here we see that same smoke captured several seconds after the final shot. For we know there was an imposter on the grassy knoll, identified himself to Dallas Police Officer Smith and Dallas Deputy Sheriff Weitzman by producing Secret Service credentials when in fact no Secret Service agent was present on the grassy knoll.
Now moving to the second assassin's actual location, the shooter
Could have easily shot over the top of the limousine windshield, which was lower than the president's head owing to the slope of the street and the high seating height of the president. Frankly, I think that assassin could have cared less about shooting over the windshield or not, simply because if he had to shoot through the windshield a second time, the investigating agency would just cover it up like they did with the first bullet hole.
This assassin would have used an auto-loading rifle equipped with sound suppressor so he would never need to take his eye off the president to reload. This is the image of a man in flight, and this is very interesting because hundreds of people are coming into Dealey Plaza out of curiosity, yet this man is leaving. That's because he's just shot the president, and he's carrying that stepladder to leave it just inside the west end of the tunnel where it won't be seen from Dealey Plaza as he makes his escape. He's not seen doing this because everyone in Dealey Plaza is either running to where the diversion has just taken place on the grassy knoll or to the source of the 3 shots from the schoolbook depository. In spite of the cheering of the crowd, the roaring of the 7 Harley-Davidsons, the 3 reports from the Texas Schoolbook Depository, and the firecracker and smoke diversion on the grassy knoll, that shouldn't someone have seen the second assassin? The answer is no, because the assassin would have been using a sound-suppressed rifle. Not only would there have been very little sound, but neither would there have been visible smoke or muzzle flash. And remember, much of the crowd in Dealey Plaza had their backs to Commerce Street, while those on the north side of Elm Street would have been looking into a very bright sun, as was Jackie Kennedy seen here squinting heavily as she looks to the southwest in Dealey Plaza. Finally, keep in mind that every eye in Dealey Plaza was first glued on the president as he reacted violently to being shot in the throat, and then horrifically as his head exploded. And who then could have looked away in the following seconds as the First Lady climbed out onto the trunk of the limousine to retrieve a piece of the president's brain, to then be shoved into the car by a diving Secret Service agent? Returning to the other end of the tunnel and the second assassin's firing position, its very selection demonstrates more inside collusion with both some Dallas police conspirators and sources within either the Secret Service or the White House because of the prior knowledge that neither Air Force General Godfrey McHugh nor Army General Ted Clifton, Kennedy's 2 military aides, would be riding in their usual position during the motorcade in the center of the front seat. For had either of them been seated there, the line of the assassin's sight would have been obstructed, making it impossible to hit the president. And because of all those false ambulance calls, we know the shooters had been practicing and had specific knowledge of the motorcade route long before it was published. Here we see evidence of even more insider collusion because the Secret Service violated its own protocol rules on motorcades by exceeding 90 degrees for a right or left-hand turn and slow way down going into the Elm Street kill zone so that Oswald and the Commerce Street arcade shooter had a nice slow-moving target.
They also required a co-conspirator for whatever utility performed electrical maintenance in that utility cabinet. They needed to know the maintenance schedule of the workers doing such maintenance so that they could be practicing without discovery and be assured the rifle hidden there would not be discovered before or in the days immediately after the assassination.
And the plot required accomplices with the authority to both prevent the assassin's discovery before and during the actual shooting, and to secure the assassin's escape route out of Dealey Plaza to the west, as well as hiding the murder weapon. And to ensure all 3, they had to control both the east and west portals of the pedestrian tunnel, and that's where the Dallas traffic cops come in. However, before examining their role in depth, in the next episode, number 6, I'll present not only how the second assassin escaped, but also the image of the assassin in flight that I, with my extreme color blindness, discovered, as well as poor but discernible images taken by 2 other photographers showing the second shooter's partner in the pedestrian tunnel immediately after the president is shot. Here in episode 6, I'll present the image of the assassin in flight, which I, as a person with extreme red-green color blindness, discovered, which those with normal color vision cannot see, as well as 2 images of the assassin's partner, a policeman, in the pedestrian tunnel, hiding the rifle and covering the second assassin's escape to the west, which I believe you will be able to see if you stop the video in several locations and examine the images very carefully.
I discovered this simply because I'm red-green colorblind.
Why would that matter? Because I, like one of only 1% of American men and virtually no American women, or one of only every 200 Americans, have a color blindness called deuteranopia. So while I can't see many colors and shades virtually everyone else can, I can see subtle shapes and patterns that 99.5% of you cannot. Pictured here are 2 color test plates with a number in each. In those, if you see something like a 74 and a 5, you have normal color vision. I, however, see a 21 and a 2. This matters because in a super enlarged high-definition photo I purchased from Getty Images, taken by UPI photographer Frank Cancelleri 20 seconds after the fatal shot struck President Kennedy, in the 3rd portal of the pedestrian tunnel that runs under the infamous triple underpass, I can see the unmistakable image of a man in flight.
So yes, I'm actually telling you I can see with these eyes President Kennedy's actual assassin. I'm not clairvoyant and I'm not crazy. I'm just colorblind.
We'll begin with the Cancelleri photo in several magnifications. Briefly first, in only the unaltered versions I, as being colorblind, see. And then for the rest of you, I'll begin with an almost cartoonish version in which I have used dramatically different colors to identify individual parts of the image. And then in several magnifications and heavily tinted and labeled versions in which I hope you can identify the image that I see unmistakably as a policeman. Following that, we'll examine a single frame of a black and white 16mm news film taken by James Darnell about the same instant, as his camera swings back and forth wildly as he's running and inadvertently captures the image of the assassin's partner, replacing the rifle back into the steel utility cabinet as the assassin escapes. Finally, we'll examine a color slide taken a few seconds later by Phil Willis, in which the very faint image of the assassin's partner is again captured in the tunnel entry. And again, as these images are all very faint, do stop the video and examine each very carefully. To recap, the second assassin has just fired from above and behind the utility cabinet door in the tunnel opening. After firing that shot, he hands the rifle off to his partner, grabs the ladder, and goes east out of Dealey Plaza, while the president's car and escort accelerate noisily up Elm Street with the crowd watching, except for those spectators in Dealey Plaza who converge on the smoke diversion on the grassy knoll. Within seconds, Frank Cancelleri, in an open convertible, 8 cars behind the president, jumps out of the car with his Rolleiflex camera, huge 2¼ square negatives, and snaps this photo. Again, as only 1 in 200 of you will be able to see the assassin in the original black and white of the photo, should you be one of those rare individuals, please stop the video here and note the timestamp. And I'll briefly post that original image here in several magnifications. For the rest of you, I'll begin with the brightly and overly colored custom cartoon image so that you can understand what to look for when we examine heavily overexposed, contrasted, tinted, enlarged, and labeled images to follow, which I'll go over in great detail using my cursor. Please note that in the following enhanced images presented, the area we'll be concentrating on is this portal, which, because of the camera's perspective, appears to be a slight parallelogram. Beginning with this first image, overexposed and super enlarged in a bluish tone. If you notice here where my cursor is, this is a cross ladder rung. Here's a side part of the ladder. Here's another step of the ladder. The side of the ladder comes down and hits the assassin's shoulder. The shoulder comes down. Here's the tricep. We're coming down. This is the back of the arm. Coming down to the elbow is here. This is the forearm. The bicep is here. This is a heavy shadow under the armpit, and the folded part of the ladder shelf is running under his arm here. There's the side rail of the ladder coming under his arm. There's a strap over his wrist here. It's either leather or canvas because it makes a sharp turn right here. So his wrist is right here. This is the back of his right hand. This is his rear end. This is his pistol belt. This is the holster on the pistol. It's a little distorted in this view. But now without the ladder, we see the back of his right thigh, his rear end. This is his dark pistol belt. Here's his holster. This is the back of his right hand. Strap here going over the wrist, probably a canvas strap, which is attached to the ladder. This is the top of his right forearm. The bottom of his right forearm, his elbow is right here, this is the back of his right arm. This is his right bicep and a shadow under his armpit. Come back up to the shoulder, back of his head, the hat visor, and below most of the face, but the left side of his head is cut off. Here's his jawline. There's a heavy shadow underneath the jawline. Here we see the visor of the hat, covering the eyes pretty much. They're just a dark impression. Here we see the white cover of his policeman's hat, and the black band is right around here. So again, here's the shoulder, the back of the right arm, the elbow is blacked out, the right forearm, the right hand making a fist. The ladder is coming down underneath his shoulder, and I believe this is the shelf under the ladder with a shadow covering it. It gets easier to see the smaller it is. Here we see the white cover of his hat. Here's the black band around the hat. The hat leather hat visor is here, and there appears to be a reflection off the visor. Here's the shoulder, the upper arm, the forearm, shadow under the armpit. This is the shelf of the ladder. The side rail is coming down under this. There's a strap over the wrist. It's a different color. It's much lighter. Here's the front corner of the pistol holster, and there's a bit of distortion here. This is the dark pistol belt. The smaller he gets, the easier he is to see. Back of the right thigh. Here's his butt. Thick policeman's dark pistol belt. The holster. The back of the right hand. The strap over this that's attached to the ladder. This is just a dark shadow between the folded shelf of the ladder. Here's the interior of his elbow. Shadow under the armpit. The shoulder. The elbow is in shadow. The white of his hat. The leather visor on his hat. The black band. This is the back of his head. This is his right temple and ear in dark shadow. Here, the side-by-side images with the ladder and without. On the left, we see the top ladder rung, the second ladder rung. Here is his shoulder. There's a distortion on the back of the tricep here. Again, the forearm, the strap over the wrist, and the right hand making a fist. The pistol belt on his rear end. Some people can make the image out better in a warmer bronze tone. Side rail of the ladder coming down. Here's the shoulder. The right side of his head is in shadow. Here's the white cover of his hat. Here you can see the leather visor on the policeman's hat, the black band that goes around the hat. Here is the face with part of the left side of the head cut off. Here we see the jawline, the shadow under the jawline, the shadow under the armpit. The side rail is coming down under his arm. A very faint image of a ladder rung that his right hand is clutching. There's a strap over the wrist, the bottom of his forearm, back of the arm with a pixelated distortion. Without the ladder, the white cover on his hat, black band around the hat, the leather visor here, semicircular. Here's his jawline, back of his head, down his shoulder, down the tricep area. The elbow is in shadow. His right forearm pit, the folded shelf of the ladder, bottom of the folded shelf, the strap over the wrist. The wrist is right here, and the right hand, his rear end is here. pistol belt, holster. Once again, the hat cover, the black band of the hat. Here's the visor edge. Right half of the face, there's actually dark here where the mouth is at, and right under the visor, it's dark where the eyes are at. Jawline, shoulder, upper arm, elbow in shadow, bottom of the forearm, shadow under the armpit. Here's the shelf of the ladder that's folded, strap over the wrist, the back of the right hand. Here's his butt, the pistol belt, the front corner of the holster, his right thigh. Smaller, the visor actually comes out a little bit better. Kind of a shine on the visor here, a black band, that elastic band that goes around the hat, bottom of the white part of the hat, the back of his head. Here's the jawline. Returning to the enlarged image of the assassin in its original shades, note the bottom red arrow labeled pistol holster. Using a known police artifact for comparison, you'll notice similarities between it and the dark shape above. Above is a Dallas police officer on the day of President Kennedy's assassination. Enlarging the photo, we see he is wearing a fairly standard handgun of the period, probably a Smith & Wesson or Colt 38 special revolver with a 4-inch barrel, like this one outlined above. A revolver and holster combination like this one would most probably have been a requirement for all uniformed Dallas police officers. Returning to the photo of the officer, note that I have superimposed the image of the outlined revolver and holster combination next to the officer's weapon. Note how they are virtually identical. Turning to the original enlarged image of the assassin, we'll concentrate on the area pointed out by the red arrow. Note in the image on the left, again I have put white dots all around the external shape of the leather holster. And I have put yellow dots around the very, very faint but different image of the pistol grip. Please notice the similarity in the shape of the holsters. Now on the right, this is very interesting because if you look very carefully, you will see that in fact, this is a lighter area in the shape of a pistol grip. Even though it is heavily pixelated, it is still identifiable as matching the shape of the pistol grip to the right. Returning to the original super-enlarged image and focusing only on the portion within the square above, after many attempts using Microsoft Photos and CyberLink Photo Director 365 programs, both individually and in random combination, and continuing to enlarge and adjust contrast, highlights, shadows, temperature, and several other settings, I finally arrived at this image, a super enlargement of the head and face of the second assassin. Because the enlargement is so incredibly extreme, the right portion is so heavily pixelated it makes the entire image harder to discern, so I've simply blacked that portion out. Now just using the discernible parts of the image, please follow along very carefully as I use my cursor to guide your inspection of the face and individual parts of the policeman's hat. Here's the bottom of the chin. This is the assassin's chin. This is the neck down here, edge of the chin. We come up to the bottom of the lower lip. The space between the lips. The upper lip on this side has the smudge on the image. I do not believe that's a mustache. You can see the edge of the upper lip on the left side of his face, but in the center of his face and on the right side, I believe the lip is obscured by this dark smudge. This dark circle here, or dark circular pattern, that is his right nostril. This is the tip of his nose. Edge comes down like this, and it is obscured by this reflection here, but the edge would come like this. This is the corner of the eye socket. We can't see the eye, it is in total shadow here. So again, the nose comes down like this, the tip of the nose, the right nostril. This is the edge of his hat. the leather hat brim, okay? The edge of the leather visor is shining right in here, and there's a reflection off the center of the leather visor. That's the leather visor on the top, and it may be, we may also be looking at the chin strap that folds up over the top of the leather visor. Here's the edge of the visor, and the very bottom edge of the visor is quite clear here. Here, this darkened band here, come down here, and we see the darkened band. That is the black elastic band, which goes around the hat, which holds on the white cover. The white cover is distorted here by ambient light. We can't see it. However, we can see the white cover of the hat. Remember, he's wearing a stop sign policeman's hat. It makes a very faint corner right here. Right here. And it comes up over here and makes a corner. Comes over here and makes a corner. The white cover starts across the top. We can see some of it here, and then it is again just obscured by the high ambient light here. This is the right side of the top point of a star. It's a badge. Here's the top shoulder of the right pointed star. Here it makes this indentation here. This point here is the indentation of 2 points of the star. So the star is shaped like this. We can see a little bit of the star on this side, but this is the clearest point on the star. We have a point here, the indentation, and come out to the other point on the star. I don't understand the badge entirely, if this is a standalone star or if it is a raised relief star as on the Dallas Police badge, which you can compare for yourself here. This is the black band, which goes around the hat, but that is definitely a star. Edge of the visor, the bottom of the eyebrow, it turns the turn onto the nose, the edge of the nose, the tip of the nose, the nostril, bottom of the bottom lip, and the chin. Both identical images, except on the right, I've drawn in the star on top, the hat band in blue, the visor with a red circular line. I've outlined the nose, nostril, and chin. Please compare those to the image on the left, which is the face of President Kennedy's actual assassin. Now we'll move on to a second image by a second cameraman, James Darnell of WBAP TV, who with his 16mm film camera, swinging wildly back and forth as he ran, captured the image of the second assassin's partner in this single frame as he hid the rifle back into the steel utility closet. As this image was taken only in 16mm and with the camera moving, the quality is of course poor, but with adjustment of exposure, contrast, and other settings, I've arrived in several magnifications at an image that is clearly a man in the tunnel at the utility closet at virtually the same instant Frank Cancelleri captured his assassin partner fleeing west out of Dealey Plaza. And as you can see from this view from inside the tunnel, not only would there be no reason for a policeman to have been in there at that moment, the place is so dark and disgusting no one else would have been in there who absolutely didn't have to be. Here at maximum enlargement of the single Darnell film frame, please note that the entire image is tilted about 10 to 15 degrees to the left as Darnell ran. Now I've placed a dotted line around the legs, arms, and torso only of the assassin's partner as he closes the utility cabinet. You may wish to return to this image and actually put your face right in the screen to see what I'm talking about here. But first I'll go over this with my cursor. This image is not only incredibly enlarged, it's also incredibly overexposed to bring out the contrast between what I believe is a human being here with his arm up, this white portion, and the dark background and darkness of the tunnel. And I've also probably tinted it slightly, and it was a black and white photograph, but I'm just trying to get as much contrast as I can in there. This is all that history left me with to work with. So starting at the upper right of the tunnel arch, the arch of the tunnel goes like this. This would be vertical, coming down this side. Here would be the cabinet door. Okay, if we come down here to the bottom, very, very faint, but discernible pattern of a foot and a leg, or at least a leg. The knee would be here. It's reaching to the front. There's a space here. We come up along this. It's very clouded, but this would be the center mass of the person's body. This is the elbow, and this is the forearm. That's the outside of the forearm, the elbow, the bottom of the tricep. The inside of the elbow, the top or the bicep, this goes into the shoulder. Very hard to see here, but it looks like a light colored collar. And of course I've overexposed this and made it several shades lighter. The neck, the left shoulder, and what I believe is the left elbow with the left hand reaching forward out of sight. Coming around the bottom of the left arm, that's in a kind of a raised chicken wing position. On the side of the torso to the waist, outlined of an automobile parked in the foreground. The trunk of an automobile. Just a portion of the second assassin's partner we can see. There's a darker image here, which I believe is the back of the head. And if you super magnify this or super enlarge it on your computer, I know it will be heavily pixelated, but there is a disc because of the way I've overexposed this. It's a policeman's hat. Whether it's beige or white, I cannot swear to, but it is a lighter colored policeman's hat. And he's placing the rifle in this closet and will remain here to guard his partner's escape, as we'll discern in a photo taken a few seconds later by Mr. Phil Willis. I initially discovered this additional image of the second assassin's partner in the tunnel entry in a low-resolution photo taken by Phil Willis, known as Willis Slide Number 7, and posted on the web by the Sixth Floor Museum in Dallas. In an effort to obtain a higher quality image, I then purchased for $2,000 one set of the original 1,500 sets of color slides sold by Mr. Willis in 1964. I then sent slide number 7, pictured above, to an independent film laboratory where it was scanned under super high resolution. Unfortunately, evidently the slides had not been carefully stored, and the enlarged image shown above had deteriorated greatly over the last 61 years as globs of photochemicals seen above. I then contacted the Sixth Floor Museum, who were gracious enough to provide me with a much larger size file image than the one I'd originally examined online. Sadly, neither it nor the slides I purchased were of as high a quality as their copy posted online. I can only speculate then that their lower resolution photo, which we'll be examining here, was taken from an original negative or slide in much better condition. At any rate, let me share what I've discovered in the lower resolution image. By comparing the presence of the press bus seen on the right with the two Chevrolet convertible camera cars seen in the previous frame from the James Darnell film, which were about 4 cars ahead of the press bus in the motorcade, I'd estimate that this photo, showing the image of the second gunman's partner, was taken between 15 and 45 seconds after the previous Darnell frame, in which the gunman's partner was just closing the utility closet door. Unlike the two previous photos, this one taken by Phil Willis was originally taken in color. Please note the pedestrian's head in the foreground, for as we zoom in, it will aid as a reference point. Continuing with original in the color that it was taken in, note again the pedestrian's head in the foreground and the arch. Out behind the pedestrian's head a bit, we can see the oval, a just very, very faint oval outline. He has moved about 3 feet to his right, your left, so we can just barely make out his face, the slightest hint of his right shoulder. Now in this image, still in color, I have overexposed the image, back of our pedestrian in the foreground, his shoulder. Now we can see the oval shaping, and we can start to make out right here the edge of a visor, just the faintest image of the policeman's hat, and we're just starting to get a hint of a band here, which I believe is the chin strap over the visor. In this image, still in color, I've gone much larger. Our pedestrian shoulder in the foreground. Face is brighter. It's incredibly pixelated. I realize that, but it is brighter than the background on our left or on our right. So this is the right side of his face, the left side of his face. Now, if you look oh so carefully, you can see a tiny reflection off the edge of his leather visor. We can see the chin strap over the visor. The hat in the middle, the hat cover is very pixelated here, but we get a hint of a shaping here and a hint of a shaping over here. Now going much smaller, but converting to black and white for a better contrast, here's the back of our pedestrian in the foreground, a hint, shoulder. Now we can see his face a little better. The oval is starting to come out more. The darkness of the tunnel to his right, of course the darkness to our right, the left side of his face, the right side of his face, we can see, actually to the left here, we can see the visor edge. Now the chin strap above the visor is really coming in a little clearer. Again, the crown of his stop sign policeman's hat. But I have turned the shadows way down and the contrast way up. Now his shoulder is coming in a little bit. Now we see the gunman's assistant's face. It's of course heavily pixelated. Now we can see a little bit more of the edge of that visor, of the leather visor. Now we're seeing the chin strap above the visor a little more clearly. Now here we can start to see the angle on the policeman's hat, the edge of the visor, the face slightly larger again in black and white. I've pointed out the edge of the disc of the hat on each side with these green arrows. Note how this comes down at an angle. Now I think you can see that chin strap even better. You can see light reflecting off the edge of the visor here, and you can see a little bit of the edge of the visor over here. Again, the right side of his face is here. And now we can see a little bit of the neck. Of course, it's very pixelated. His right shoulder, we can't see anything, but we can see the dark contrast to his right of the darkness of the tunnel behind. A larger version of the same thing, but notice if you look very carefully here, how you can see the hat going up at an angle. But this is definitely the chin strap above the visor. The edge of the visor, can you see the reflection off the edge? The right side of his face, now you see it comes down into his neck, the shoulder a little bit, and then it's heavily pixelated. This is absurdly magnified, the back of our pedestrian's head. Here's our subject's face, but now you can see the neck start to develop here. The face comes out. His right side is totally pixelated, but there is the darker area behind him in the tunnel. But here, can you see the edge of the visor? This reflection off the edge of his hat visor right here. The two types of white covers is worn by the Dallas Police Prevention Bureau, and the Traffic Division was a white strap with a white bill. For sergeants and superior officers, it was a black bill with a silver or gold chin strap. It's super heavily pixelated here. We can't see the chin strap as clearly as we did before, but we can see the shape of the hat. I do hope you'll examine these images closely as well as all the detailed evidence presented. If you found this video of value, I do hope you'll recommend it to other serious people. And should you be colorblind like me and be able to see the untinted images of the assassin in the cancellary photo, I'd appreciate it if you'd email me at my address on the closing page of this presentation. In the next episode, number 7, I'll present how several Dallas policemen were active participants in the murder of President Kennedy and how their very sketchy behavior and several outright and stupid lies prove it. And now the Dallas traffic cops. To understand certain members' involvement in the assassination, we need to determine their locations in and around Dealey Plaza. We also need to learn the identities of those traffic cops that I suspect of being involved, how they came to be assigned to their various locations, who assigned them, how those in charge of posting those assignments came to be in charge, the actions of those senior officers just before the assassination, and glaring omissions of information about some of the actions of the traffic cops in and around Dealey Plaza during the subsequent investigation. To initially show the locations of the traffic officers in and around Dealey Plaza, I'll begin by relying heavily on aerial photos. I'll also be using 2 magnifications of a map of the overall area, and for your convenience, I will outline the route of the President's motorcade. In charge of making the officer assignments was Captain Purdue Lawrence. He was assisted by Lieutenant W. Southard and Sergeant D. Harkness. Lawrence's appointment to make these assignments by Deputy Chief Batchelor and Assistant Chief Lumpkin is itself a bit odd, for according to Lawrence's own Warren Commission testimony, he had never been in charge of a security detail for a presidential visit before, as Captain R. Thompson had been. This may not at first seem important under normal circumstances. However, only about a month before the president's visit, Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson had been physically accosted by a hostile right-wing crowd in Dallas, and the apprehension for violence during the president's visit was quite high, as can be seen by this Dallas newspaper story with Police Chief Curry a month earlier about security concerns for the president's upcoming visit. So doesn't this seem like an odd time to you to be breaking in a new man with no experience? The day before the president's visit, this is the page of those assignments in and around Dealey Plaza as listed by Captain Lawrence. In Houston, 3 officers under the supervision of Sergeant Harkness. At Houston and Elm, 3 officers. At the Triple Underpass, Officers Foster and J.C. White. At the Stemmons Freeway Overpass, Officer Murphy. At the railroad overpass over the Stemmons Freeway, Officers Lomax and E.V. Brown. And finally, at the Stemmons Freeway overpass at Industrial, Officer Shankles. There's no assignment or order for any officer to have created a roadblock west of the Triple Underpass on Main Street, and yet here it is. Captain Lawrence had been assigned additional officers just 3 hours before the motorcade's arrival, and has in his own handwriting assigned each to a specific location, and once again there is no assignment for any officer on Main west of the Triple Underpass. However, at the last minute, Captain Lawrence did assign officers Knowles and Wright to the Stemmons Freeway to slow traffic so it could be stopped for the president's motorcade. He also assigned officers King and Williams to patrol Main Street from Field to Houston. All those officers rode 3-wheeled Harleys. And H.A. Ehrman to patrol on Houston between Main and Elm. In addition, that morning, Chief Curry assigned 19 additional officers from the patrol division who wore blue hats, unlike all the other officers who wore white, for Captain Lawrence to use as additional security. So the official final officer placement should have looked like this. And I'll begin with the last assignment of the officer from the patrol division, who, although I don't know his name, is seen here in a frame from the Hughes film. At the top of the photo are King and Williams patrolling Main, Harkness, Fox, Denham, and Lewis at the corner of Main and Houston, the patrolman on Houston, Ehrman patrolling Houston, Barnett, Smith, and E. Smith at the corner of Elm and Houston, Foster on the east side of the triple underpass, White on the west side of the triple underpass, Lomax and Brown on the railroad bridge over Stemmons Freeway, Murphy on the overpass above the freeway entry ramp, Shankles down at the corner of Elm and Industrial, and Knowles and Wright on Stemmons Freeway to slow traffic. But nowhere is there any plan or placement for an officer to roadblock Main west of the triple underpass. And here are those same assignments on a map. Again, as shown by the blue arrow, there was no plan for a roadblock on Main west of the triple underpass because it was already blocked at the corner of Main and Houston. The final officer placement looked like this. Officer King eventually ends up at Main and Houston. I'll explain why that's important in a moment. There he's joined by Sergeant Harkness, Fox, and Lewis, who has been moved over to the corner of Houston and Commerce. Officer Allen is also now there, having been verbally assigned earlier that morning by Captain Lawrence. Denham, who had been at Main and Houston, has moved to Elm and Houston with Barnett and the two Smiths. The officer from the Patrol Division is on Houston, while Officer Ehrman is nowhere to be found. Foster and White are on the triple overpass. Lomax, Brown, Murphy, Knowles, and Wright are at their original assigned locations. Officer Williams is manning the unauthorized and unplanned mystery roadblock. Williams' location at that roadblock, as seen above, and J.C. White's actual location, as seen here from west of the Dealey Plaza, were so critical to the success or failure of the second assassin's escape simply because of both of their proximity to the gunman's escape route. Anyone, and especially any policeman, coming out of the western portal of the tunnel would have been nearly impossible for them to have missed. We know Williams was assigned to that location by the police report of Officer King, which was provided to the FBI. He reported, "I had assignment to cut all traffic off of Main Street west of the triple underpass. This was later changed by Sergeant Harkness because his radio was out and I had channel 2 on my motor. Officer R.W. Williams took my assignment on Main Street west of the triple underpass and I worked intersection of Main and Houston." It's critical here that you remember this part of King's statement. Quote, "This was later changed by Sergeant Harkness because his radio was out and I had channel 2 on my motor." For later, when we return to the testimony and actions of Sergeant Harkness, this will prove another one of his several lies. As to what we can learn from Officer Williams, the answer is not much. For not only wasn't he called to testify before the Warren Commission, neither was any police report by him submitted to the FBI. In an exhibit number 1358 submitted to the Warren Commission by Dallas Police Chief Curry, listing all the officers in and around Dealey Plaza, Williams isn't even listed, nor is Officer Ehrman, who was supposed to be patrolling Main Street. Neither do we get testimony or even a police report from Officer Lomax, who's down on railroad overpass over the Stemmons Freeway. Did he perhaps see something he wasn't supposed to see? Then there is Lieutenant Southard, for he is mentioned in Captain Lawrence's Warren Commission testimony as having been part of the security arrangement, and in the police report of Officer J.C. White as having given White specific orders about not letting anyone on top of the railroad underpass. But strangely, I can find no police report made out by Lieutenant Southard and turned in to the FBI, nor was he called to testify before the Warren Commission, nor indeed was Assistant Chief Lumpkin called to testify or submit a police report, although he too was in the chain of command for the presidential visit security, as well as actually preceding the motorcade by a quarter mile along the motorcade route. And according to Secret Service Warren Commission testimonies, one of the reasons that the presidential motorcade went on Elm Street to the Stemmons Freeway with its 120-degree turn off Houston in front of the school book depository in direct violation of the Secret Service's own rules, instead of taking the safer route straight down Main Street and turning 90 degrees onto Industrial, is that Lumpkin advised against using Industrial as it was full of winos and bums and had rough pavement. Above, from a different perspective, we see the route taken in black, with the 120-degree turn in front of the schoolbook depository at the red arrow. But if the Secret Service had ignored Lumpkin and taken Industrial as shown by the blue line, the president would have gone straight to the Trade Mart, his destination, thereby bypassing Elm Street, the sniper's nest in the schoolbook depository, and a prearranged killing zone altogether. And remember, those officers on the triple underpass had been instructed to keep the overpass free of all spectators. Yet Lumpkin, along with 2 other officers and Army Lieutenant Colonel George Whitmire, commander of the 488th Military Intelligence Detachment, of which Lumpkin was also a member, preceded the motorcade by a planned quarter-mile, and he stops at several points, including Elm and Houston, to check on his officers. Yet he proceeds directly under all those civilians on the Triple Railroad underpass and does nothing. But that's not all, for Captain Lawrence, on his own initiative, drove the route a minute or 2 ahead of Lumpkin, and he too drives directly under those standing on the underpass and says nothing to his officers. We'll revisit more of Captain Lawrence's sketchy behavior in a few minutes, but first let's examine the testimony of a cop who tells an outright lie, and a stupid one at that. The other officer stationed nearest the west end of the pedestrian tunnel and the assassin's escape route is Officer J.C. White. You'll find his Warren Commission testimony very interesting. Where were you? Mr. White responds, on the west side of the overpass. Mr. Ball said, on the west side of the overpass? White says, yes. Ball asks, where were you with reference to Elm, Main, or Commerce Street as they go underneath the overpass? Mr. White says, approximately at the north curb of Main Street. Thus, looking at an aerial photo, Officer White would be right at the red arrow location. However, when we look at a photograph taken by Mel McIntyre seconds after the presidential limousine has passed out from underneath the triple underpass at the location of Main Street and the north curb on the top of the overpass, there doesn't appear to be any sign of Officer White. It appears that he is over the south curb of Main Street on the west side of the triple underpass. So when looking at an aerial photo of the triple underpass, we notice that instead of being here, Officer White is over here, much nearer to the point at which our second assassin escaped. Just so there was no mistake, Ball even went back and asked White to initial his position on a diagram that had been just made by Officer Foster. And again, he responds when asked on the north curb of Main Street. But reading from the actual Warren Commission testimony, we see that's not the only one of Officer White's interesting answers. Mr. Ball, did you see the president's car come into sight? Mr. White, no, sir. First time I saw it, it has passed under the triple underpass. Mr. Ball, you were too far away to see it, were you? Mr. White, there was a freight train traveling. There was a train passing between the location I was standing and the area from which the procession was. A big, long freight train, and I did not see it. You didn't see the procession? No, sir. This seems really strange because in both the Bell and the Weitzman films, taken just as the president's car is under the triple underpass, there is no train visible. Even more tellingly, from this Phil Willis slide, we see the presidential motorcade heading down Elm Street, and the president hasn't even been hit with the first shot. Yet even though the president is 10 seconds away from the triple underpass, when we zoom in on the upper left-hand corner of the photo, there is no train. Looking from the west side of the underpass in a photograph taken 10 or 12 seconds later by Mel McIntyre, we can clearly see the presidential limousine. But again, where's the train? From where he was located on the Stemmons Freeway, Officer Murphy could see the president's motorcade turning off of Main Street on to Houston. As they both had the same line of sight, and as Murphy could see the president on Main, there was no train. And remember, in the Mel McIntyre photo, we see there is no northbound train. But that's not what Officer White testifies. He testifies that he did not see the presidential limousine until it emerged from underneath the triple underpass. A moment later, he doubles down on the lie. Wait, as soon as the train passed, I went over and on the northwest side of the depository building. As soon as the train passed. As soon as the train passed? Where is the train? If there is no train, how could you wait for it to pass? This was a railroad switching yard, and the speed limits were quite limited here, so we don't see it to the north. However, these photographs alone aren't my only reason for believing that Officer White lied. There's the testimony of his superior, Cap Lawrence, who said, "That's right, that's my handwriting, and during that week I was next told, of course, to contact other people regarding the route connecting with the motorcade to see that no trains would be coming across at the time that the presidential motorcade was passing through." And if all that weren't enough, I think this is an even more compelling reason to believe that Officer White lied. Here, let's return to Robert Davison, who was at that time a 32-year-old university-educated engineer and Southern U.S. sales manager for the Victor Comptometer Adding Machine Company. Robert, could you please tell us how you came to be on the triple underpass that day?
Well, my office in Dallas was a half a block north of Main Street, and he was due to come through the middle of Dallas on Main Street at 12 noon. And I came down from my office about 11:30 to give myself time to find a place to stand to see him. Well, when I got down there, they were standing at least 10 deep on the sidewalks, and I'm not 8 feet tall. I knew I couldn't see a thing. So I quickly got to thinking, well, my car was just half a block away on Elm Street in a parking lot. So I went and got the car, and I drove down Elm Street. There was very little traffic, and went underneath the railroad bridge on Elm Street, and I pulled off on the grass to get my car out of the way so I wouldn't be in the way of the motorcade. And I climbed up a very steep incline to get up to the railroad tracks. That bridge is a railroad bridge. And it took me quite a while to get up there, but I finally did. And I walked toward the Elm Street Bridge.
As you approached the actual overpass, did anyone challenge you?
And there was a policeman standing there. And I asked him, I said, would it be all right if I stood here and watched the motorcade? And he said, sure, not a problem. We got to talking about the weather and the crowd of people and one thing or another. And it just so happens that is the only overpass on the entire route that the motorcade took that does not have a screen in front of it.
Overpass. Nobody challenged you?
Nobody challenged me at all. This man, this policeman, I'll say, quote, policeman, I assume he was a policeman. He was very friendly, and he said, no problem. You stand wherever you want to.
Dallas officer J.C. White, who was located on the west side of the triple underpass, testified before the Warren Commission that he heard no shots nor saw President Kennedy struck because there was a big, long freight train going by. Did you see any train?
Railroad traffic had been stopped, both southbound trains and northbound trains. There was no railroad traffic.
Why does Officer White testify to such a stupid lie? Because he had already told the same lie in his earlier police report which the FBI had. Quote, A Texas and Pacific freight train was traveling north on the railroad tracks between the parade and me. And in that same report, we learn who assigned him there. Quote, I was given the assignment by Lieutenant W.F. Southard. As I recall, he instructed me to keep all persons off the overpass at this location during the parade. White is then asked when was the first time he saw the presidential motorcade. And here is one of the few points where White tells the partial truth accidentally. Quote, I saw it. It has passed under the triple underpass. Remember White's position in the McIntosh photo? Well, here in the Mark Bell photo, we see he was at least telling the truth. Look closely at this small white patch. That is the white octagonal cover on his hat. Notice the points. As you can see in this contemporary photo, those Dallas police officers in the traffic and safety divisions, as well as some supervisors, wore hats with the white cover. Now in this photo, you can see a Dallas policeman with a similar hat looking away from the camera. Note how the white of the hat is much more visible from the rear than the front. Now back to Officer White. Imagine what his hat would look like if it were tipped back slightly on his head as he looked to the west. But why is Officer White looking to the west? President Kennedy's car is at this instant under the triple underpass, and there sure as hell is no train, as we see here in the Mark Bell frame. I think he's looking west to help ensure the second assassin's escape route is unimpeded. Moving on to Williams, the other officer closest to the assassin's actual escape route, who is maintaining the unauthorized roadblock on Main, which does not appear in any of the original printed records. Why does he have Main Street closed here when it is already closed up here at Houston? His position in no way could impede the president's route. And they certainly couldn't have worried about people getting too close to the president. Look at these crowds all along Main Street. The reason they put up a second roadblock on Main Street west of the triple underpass was to prevent any trucks or tall vehicles from obstructing the assassin's line of sight. Otherwise, it would have been blocked like this or this, thus making shooting the president impossible. But I have two more indications that the Dallas police created a killing zone for the second assassin. The first is the testimony of Gene Hill and Mary Moore, who stated that on the day of the assassination, they had charmed a young Dallas policeman stationed at the intersection of Elm and Houston, to letting them view the motorcade from the grassy area along the south curb of Elm Street, which they had otherwise closed to the public. But why had they closed this area off? No, the reason this area was closed off was to provide the clear line of sight for the second assassin to President Kennedy as he came down Elm Street. For if they had let the crowds gather along the south curb on the grass, these people would have blocked the assassin's line of aim, as seen from the assassin's point of view looking directly up Elm. Now let's examine the testimony and actions of Dallas Police Sergeant Harkness, who was located at the corner of Main and Houston, and who I believe not only lied under oath before the Warren Commission, but moreover was instrumental in not only making the officer assignments in Dealey Plaza, which we know by the testimony of Officer J.D. Foster in response to a line of questioning by Committee Counsel Balin, where Harkness was located when he heard the first shot. Harkness replies, I had started west on Main Street to the, I don't know what they call this area here, to which Balin adds Plaza. Harkness continues, on the Plaza area where the crowd had observed the president as he went west on Elm Street. But Harkness' answer makes no sense because he's a 41-year-old man, not a starstruck teenager, and he's just seen the president and Mrs. Kennedy from 10 feet away. Why on earth would he then walk 75 feet to see the back of their heads from over 250 feet away? But let's continue. Mr. Balin, how many shots did you hear? Harkness, 3. Mr. Balin, what did you do after you heard those noises? Do you know they were shots, by the way? Harkness, yes, sir. Balin, what did you do? When I saw the first shot in the president's car slow almost to a stop. Mr. Balin, when you saw the first shot, what do you mean by that? Harkness, when I heard the first shot and saw the president's car almost come to a stop and some of the agents piling off the car, I went back to the intersection to get my motorcycle. Mr. Balin, you were in the process of doing that when you heard the second and third shots? Mr. Harkness, yes, sir. I think Harkness lied. I don't believe he walked west into Dealey Plaza, nor do I, given his position at the time he was captured in the Hughes film, that what he claims is even possible. To prove that, I have to establish his location at the point relative to the position of the president's limousine when Harkness testifies he saw it, quote, slow almost to a stop and some of the agents piling off the car, unquote. But to do that, I first must establish the exact location from which Bob Hughes caught Harkness on film. In this frame from the Hughes film, we see the left front hubcap of the president's car in the distance and the right hand grip of Sergeant Harkness' three-wheeled Harley parked heading north, with both the north and south boundary lines of the crosswalk in the foreground. Clearly, Hughes has positioned himself in the intersection about in the center of the left lane looking north. Here, about 26 to 28 seconds earlier, Hughes had been turned at a 90-degree angle to his right, looking up Main Street as the president's motorcade approached. Please note that from his position here, the camera's near central point of view lies a foot left or north of the dividing line between the two eastbound lanes. I think if we then take that point of view and overlay it with Hughes' point of view looking north up Houston Street, at the point they intersect will give us a reasonable estimate of the point from which Hughes caught Harkness' image walking in front of the camera. In these three frames, we see Harkness even as only a shirt sleeve appears in the last. By timing the Hughes film, we know this frame, showing the Vice President's silver gray car just beginning to turn onto Elm, was 3 seconds earlier than the last frame we see Harkness leave. If we then go to frame number 139 of the Zapruder film, we can see this corresponds to the previous image on the Hughes film. So as frame number 139 was taken 3 seconds earlier than the last frame we see Harkness, if we add 3 seconds or 55 Zapruder frames, we can determine that at Zapruder frame number 194, the Kennedy limousine is about here and Sergeant Harkness here at the red arrow. As Harkness testified he heard and saw the shots as the president's car slowed and the agents bailed off, that would correspond with this frame of the Muchmore film, or about Zapruder frame number 310, meaning about 126 Zapruder frames or 6.5 seconds have elapsed, giving Harkness only 6.5 seconds to walk from his location here to a point where he could see around the tree and the monument about 75 feet. Here's why that wasn't possible. Humans average about 3.5 miles per hour or 5.13 feet per second walking. However, we'll credit Sergeant Harkness as walking briskly at 4 miles per hour or 5.8 feet per second, meaning that to cover the 75 feet from his starting position to a point he could see the action around the edge of the monument would require a little over 12 seconds. But from his starting position, the Kennedy limousine was only 116 Zapruder frames, or about 6.5 seconds from Zapruder frame 310. Sergeant Harkness was 5.5 seconds short. And from the Charles Bronson film taken a couple seconds before, clearly shows no sign of Harkness, but Harkness did see the agent jump off the follow-up car. But he saw it from the seat of his motorcycle, seen parked here a moment earlier. It was to the motorcycle Harkness was going. This is the only way it could have happened, for if Harkness were at position X above where he claims to have been, there is no way he could have ran back to his motorcycle, kick-started it, for these did not have electric starters, and got to this point in the Pascal film where the president car is still under the triple underpass in 7 seconds. No, I believe it was Harkness' intent to prevent any bystander standing north of Main from interfering with the second assassin's escape. Here we see him enter the frame at the bottom of the film taken by Patsy Pascal perhaps 8 seconds later. In another frame about 1 second after that, Harkness has traveled all of 10 or 11 feet, which equates to the blazing speed of about 7 or 8 miles per hour. Please consider, Sergeant Harkness has just seen the president shot at, and he's only going 7 or 8 miles per hour. And if that weren't fantastic enough, please note in this frame that the bystanders on the grassy area are not waving or trying to get Harkness' attention. Yet he slows down even more. He's so unconcerned about getting to the crime scene that if we look at the back of his motorcycle in shadow, where the brake lights are located, He hasn't even used the brakes. He's just letting the engine's compression stop the motorcycle. But let's go back a dozen seconds. Harkness says he saw the action that could only happen after Zapruder Frame 310, but it is about that point, or a half a second after, that all the witnesses on the Triple Railroad underpass report seeing the diversion smoke come from under the bushes. Well, almost all the witnesses except for Officer J.D. Foster. Anyway, all of the civilians there saw the smoke, but from his angle, how could Harkness not see the smoke? And for that matter, how did Officer Foster not see the smoke? Returning to his testimony, Harkness told Counsel Balin that someone indicated that the shots came front. When Balin asked him who, Harkness couldn't remember. Then Harkness said, quote, "I went down to Industrial to see if I could see anyone fleeing that area," unquote. Mr. Balin, "What did you see?" Harkness, "I didn't see anyone, so I come back to the front of the book depository." The red arrows above indicate his supposed path going west on Main to Industrial, and the blue arrows where he was looking. And he doesn't see anyone. And yet we know within seconds of the fatal shot, Robert Davison, here, goes to the west side of the railroad embankment and in his business suit slides down and runs all the way across this completely open area in that business suit to jump in his dark green Chevrolet parked along Stemmons freeway ramp, but Harkness doesn't see him. But how is that possible? But then neither do White, Williams, Lomax and Brown, or Murphy. And Murphy, when asked the names of the two officers on the Triple Overpass only a few hundred feet away, men that he worked with, if not every day, presumably on many occasions in the past, Murphy responded, "I don't know their names." One might say we have only Robert Davison's word. That wouldn't be right, for Davison was seen by off-duty Dallas policeman Tom Tilson and his daughter Judy. Tilson was giving his teenage daughter a ride downtown and had just heard about a shooting in Dealey Plaza on his radio. Moving east on Commerce, he noticed people jumping into the median and running toward Dealey Plaza. When he saw Bob Davison suspiciously running the other direction, he and his daughter drove up to Houston, turned back west under the underpass. They caught up to a car they thought was the car they'd seen, wrote down the license number, and later gave the number to the Dallas police detectives, who they described as completely disinterested. But that's not the end of the sketchy answers from these cops west of Dealey Plaza. For when testifying to the Warren Commission, E.V. Brown not only says there were no civilians on the Triple Underpass, but only 6 months after the assassination, he doesn't even remember White and Foster. Well, Officer Foster becomes the second outright liar of the group when he says he only allowed the railroad workers on the underpass, when Bob Davison testified that they actually invited him up. Along with Brown, Lomax fails to see Davison running right toward them after the shooting, and Williams not only isn't called to testify, nor is a police report from him supplied to the FBI. He isn't even identified as having been there by Chief Curry or Captain Lawrence. And speaking of Williams at the mysterious roadblock on Main west of the Triple Underpass, he was assigned there by Sergeant Harkness, because Harkness' radio was out, according to Officer King's police report. Now let's return to Harkness' testimony just after he gets on his motorcycle. Harkness, "I went west on Main to observe the area between the railroad tracks and Industrial." Mr. Balin, "Why did you go down there?" Harkness, "By the way, the people, when I went into this area, everybody was hitting the ground and someone led us to indicate that the shots were coming into the cars." Balin, "Do you know who that someone was?" Harkness, "No, sir." Balin, "What did that person do that indicated that?" Harkness, "I don't remember." Balin, "Then what did you do?" Harkness, "I went down to Industrial to see if I could see anyone fleeing that area." So as you can see above, Harkness says he went south on Main to Industrial, which takes him within a few feet of Officer Williams, who he's just assigned to this roadblock position. Well, within seconds of the President of the United States being shot at in all this confusion and chaos, does Harkness ask Williams if he's seen anything? Well, let's return to his testimony to find out. Mr. Balin, "What did you see?" Harkness, "I didn't see anyone, so I come back to the front of the book depository and went around to this fence that was across the street from Elm Street. What do you mean across the street from Elm Street? Again, I will have to. Near the railroad track. Behind the building? No, sir. This area right here. See, Elm Street goes down. Don't you find it very odd that not only doesn't Sergeant Harkness ask Williams anything, he never even mentions Williams' existence? Well, perhaps he just forgot. No. In just a moment, I'll demonstrate not only that he's concealing information here, but moreover, where he's caught himself in yet another lie. Now remembering Officer King's testimony, he was assigned to the unauthorized and unplanned roadblock on Main west of the Triple Underpass first, but was replaced there by the mysterious Officer Williams by Sergeant Harkness, and was recalled to Main in Houston because, according to his testimony, quote, this was later changed by Sergeant Harkness because his radio was out and I had channel 2 on my motor. Now, Dallas police had 2 radio channels, and on that day, normal police activity was held on channel 1. Well, channel 2 had been reserved exclusively for all activity regarding the president's visit. As you can see in the top sentence, Officer King's motorcycle radio was number 289. But looking at the radio log for that day on channel 2, later, after the president has been shot, the police radio on Harkness unit number 260 has miraculously fixed itself. Thus he becomes the 3rd traffic cop caught in an outright lie that day by his own testimony. Now that he's been caught in an outright lie, I'd like to return to 3 of his answers in his earlier testimony, 2 of which seem very hard to believe. I've marked those 2 above with red arrows. Counsel Balin, you mean from some point in front of the cars? Harkness, yes. Mr. Balin, do you know who that someone was? Harkness, no, sir. Mr. Balin, what did that person do that indicated that? Mr. Harkness, I don't remember. Mr. Balin, then what did you do? Harkness, I went down to Industrial to see if I could see anyone fleeing that area. Mr. Balin, what did you see? Harkness, I didn't see anyone, so I come back to the front of the book depository and went round to this fence that was across the street from Elm Street. So first, Harkness has us believe that he has no memory of the person he first talked to. Then after going down Main Street, and again within a few feet of Officer Williams, he makes no mention of him. Well, perhaps he just forgot? Returning to his testimony a moment later, Balin says, now you just picked out a little small book, one of those little pocket notebooks. Harkness, yes, sir. Or a notepad from your pocket here. Is that the original notations you made? Harkness, yes, sir. When did you make that notation? Harkness, immediately after the shooting. Now let's return to his superior, Captain Lawrence, and examine a bit more of his hard-to-believe testimony. Beginning with a question by Committee Counsel Griffin, Griffin asks Lawrence, did you question any of these men after the president was shot to determine whether or not they had seen anyone in the windows of the Texas School Book Depository building? Lawrence, yes, however, when I questioned the man had already been questioned by Mr. Sorrells, and this would be Officer J.E. Murphy, and the other 2 men I questioned were Officers J.W. Foster and J.C. White. I questioned J.W. Foster regarding the men that were alongside him on the overpass, on the Triple Underpass where the president was to go. Griffin, did you question Sergeant Harkness? Lawrence, no, I didn't question Sergeant Harkness. Griffin, did you question Officer King, W.K. King? Captain Lawrence, no. Did you question Officer J.B. Allen? Lawrence, no. Did you question Officer Denham? Lawrence, no. Or Officer W.E. Barnett? Lawrence, no. Officer J.M. Smith? Lawrence, no, I didn't. Officer E.L. Smith? Lawrence, no, I didn't. Mr. Griffin, do you know of anyone in the police department who questioned those men after the assassination to determine whether or not they had been observing the windows in the Texas School Book Depository building and had seen anybody in those buildings? Captain Lawrence, I know that all of those men have been questioned and that they were all of these men to be questioned and that the investigation was being handled by the Secret Service. And this is one reason why I did not question these men. Lawrence's testimony here is fantastic for two reasons. First, as a senior police officer, it would not only have been his duty, but in protecting his own career, to have carefully questioned all his men. And second, out of simple human curiosity, wouldn't anyone in his position have wanted to know all the details of the murder? While on the subject of Captain Lawrence, there are two other questions to explore. The first is in regard to what we learned from assassination witnesses Murray Moorman and Jean Hill, who were allowed onto the grassy area south of Elm Street after they'd flirted with a patrolman stationed at Elm in Houston. Seen in this photograph more clearly looking from the south, we know by their Warren Commission testimonies they were stationed like this, with J.M. Smith stopping the southbound traffic at Elm, E.L. Smith stationed on the east side of Houston, south of Elm, and Officer Barnett stopping southbound traffic on Houston at Elm, but also helping with traffic in front of the school book depository. So Officer Barnett was most likely the officer who let the two girls into the grassy area. Yet we know from all three officers, when asked under oath about their assigned duties that day, none of them mentions anything about keeping the public off the grassy area. Since we know by Officer J.C. White's testimony he had been picked by Captain Lawrence to testify before the Warren Commission, and as Captain Lawrence had given each man his specific assignment that morning, that not only did Captain Lawrence pick these three men to testify, it was he who coached these men to omit any reference in their testimony to closing the grassy area to the public. And it was Captain Lawrence who picked which officers in Dealey Plaza would testify. It was he who chose to exclude Officer Williams from testifying, even though Williams was the officer at ground level closest to the second assassin's escape route and far closer to the actual shooting of the president than either Officers Murphy or E.B. Brown. And remember, not only doesn't Williams testify, there is never even a police report from him provided to the FBI or the Warren Commission. The second assassin is carrying a stepladder as he escapes out the arcade to the west. In an obscene irony, if the second assassin was a Dallas cop, the safest and easiest cover and means of escape would have been to have crossed the street and helped in the search for the shooter behind the grassy knoll fence, and or proceeded to the school book depository building, take up a post there. And remember, these weren't just cops, they were traffic cops from both the Traffic Division and the Accident Prevention Bureau. Please imagine the response of traffic police to an ordinary pedestrian being killed by a car. Those policemen would immediately close the street through traffic until they investigated the crime. They certainly knew how to do that 45 minutes later, as we can see above, where they've closed off Patton Street to traffic at the scene of Officer Tippett's murder. And yet here, where you have 11 officers, 10 of whom are traffic officers, and immediately after the President of the United States is murdered in the middle of the street, these cops not only don't stop traffic, it was already stopped, they turn the traffic loose through the middle of the most important crime scene in American history. Or is it more likely that this was done on purpose to cause chaos and confusion to allow the assassin's escape? I'm not accusing the Dallas police force per se, but the actions and testimonies of some officers of the Traffic Division and Accident Prevention Bureau as selected by Captain Lawrence are very suspicious. A further example of that can be seen above. Within direct line of sight of the Texas School Book Depository on Houston Street are no less than 10 of those men. Yet only two-wheeled motorcycle officer Marion Baker, who is in the motorcade and is not a member of this picked group, reacts by going to and searching the school book depository. But Officer Baker, an honest cop, wasn't the only one to have noticed a shot coming from the depository. For in the Alshins photo taken just after the first shot and before the last two, members of the crowd are already turning their attention to the depository. Zooming in on the left side of the image, we see three people have completely turned to look back toward the depository building and ignore the president. Likewise, in a view of the center of the picture, we see three more women and the man in the hat reacting the same way, as is Governor Connolly at the red arrow, who has turned completely to his right and is looking over his right shoulder. And finally, in the right side of the picture, in the follow-up car, we see three Secret Service agents reacting to the source of the shot. But again, not one of the 10 cops stationed there sees a thing. Nor did even one of these 10 other officers in the moments leading up to the assassination, who are supposedly trained observers, notice Oswald with the rifle, while at the same time he had been seen with the rifle by several civilians. And then there's the Warren Commission testimony of Officer Murphy, who, when asked the names of the two three-wheeled officers just up the road from him on the Stemmons Freeway, Murphy answers, "I can't recall. I know them, but I can't recall who they were." Nor when asked by Counsel Ball if he knows the names of the two officers on the triple underpass, he replies, "No, sir, I don't." Then Ball asks, "Did they have three-wheelers?" To which Murphy replies, "No, I couldn't say." I find this less than forthcoming on Murphy's part, because he obviously could see the three-wheeler parked in the middle of Main Street only a couple hundred feet away. A more honest response might have been something like, "Well, there was a three-wheeler near the underpass, but I don't know to which officer it belonged." My point is this. I think his answer was evasive because he didn't want to disclose the presence of Officer Williams, who, remember, for whom not only was a police report never submitted, but his very presence there was never even officially acknowledged. And then there's Officer Brown over on the railroad bridge over the freeway, when asked about the officers on the triple underpass, answered he couldn't remember who they were. While everyone else alive in America on that day could tell you, 50 years later, exactly where they were and who they were with. For the Traffic Division and Accident Prevention Bureau simply weren't that big, a few dozen officers. And we know from Captain Lawrence's written report to Chief Curry that, quote, traffic assignments were given to each man on the morning of November 22, 1963. I personally talked to the men assembled in the detail room. No, the testimony here of both Murphy and Brown, who claim they can't identify their fellow officers on that day, simply isn't credible. However, looking at these individual assignments in detail led me to another question. Just why were so many officers assigned here in Dealey Plaza, near the end of the parade route, as compared to those street assignments to the east on Main and Harvard as shown above? On the motorcade route on Harvard, we see the officers posted at every intersection. However, from the corner of Main and Houston to Elm and Houston, just in front of the school book depository, a little over a block, there are 11 officers. And if you add in Foster, Williams, and J.C. White, there are no less than 14 officers posted to Dealey Plaza. Why so many cops here? It's almost as if something was planned to happen there that required extreme control of any spectators present. For remember, the grassy area between Main and Elm Street was closed to the public also. That's why so few people were on the grass during the actual assassination. And of those, Mary Moorman and Jean Hill aside, most of them came onto the grass at the last minute from the corner of Main and Houston after the motorcade had passed there, as seen in this still photo by Charles Bronson. The reason those cops were assigned to Dealey Plaza was to create and maintain an unobstructed line of sight killing zone by ensuring that no members of the public would either get in the way of the assassin or be able to notice or capture the second assassin as he escaped. But on that infamous afternoon, there was just no end to peculiar behavior by the Dallas cops. For here we see at the red arrow what appears to be a senior officer in the Dallas Police Department, just having watched the President of the United States have his head blown off. And does he spring into action in response to the greatest murder since Abraham Lincoln? Nah. He just moseys on back without even a particle of the curiosity his female companion displays. For the next number of minutes, among the 14 traffic cops posted in and around Dealey Plaza, who are joined shortly by several more officers on motorcycles, not only does no one think to close off the traffic exiting the plaza, they actually allow so much stop traffic to travel on Elm Street that Deputy Roger Craig later testifies that he can't even cross the street because the traffic was so heavy. 48 hours later, I believe that several more members of the department were accessories to the murder of Lee Oswald by Jack Ruby. Although I would guess that several officers were involved, the only two I feel comfortable in naming are Officer Roy Vaughn, who allowed Ruby access to the police department basement parking area by allowing Jack Ruby to walk past him down the ramp into the basement that Vaughn was assigned to guard. And the second is Sergeant Patrick Dean, who assigned Vaughn there. I base this largely on the Warren Commission testimony of Napoleon Daniels, who stated he saw a man resembling Ruby walk down the ramp past Vaughn unchallenged, and who Daniels thought had a gun in his pocket. In fact, Daniels advised that he did not see how Officer Vaughn could have missed seeing the individual who walked by him. I believe Dean was involved because it is he who posted Vaughn at the ramp, for only the Dallas police could have allowed Ruby into the basement. Second, Dean was known to be on very good terms with Dallas mob boss Chivelo. And finally, Dean failed a polygraph examination about Oswald's murder, even though he was allowed to phrase the questions put to him. I also don't believe Lee Oswald killed President Kennedy, but it wasn't for lack of trying. I do believe he hit Governor Connally with his second shot, the third overall, and was part of the plot. We know from episode 6 by both the Cancelleri photo and the Phil Willis slide that there were at least 2 Dallas cops in the pedestrian tunnel when President Kennedy was shot, and with no legitimate reason for being there. In summation, several Dallas policemen had the means to reroute the motorcade into Dealey Plaza in front of the depository, construct a killing zone ambush with the unrecorded and unnecessary extra roadblock on Main Street, and by prohibiting pedestrians from the grassy area in the plaza, control ingress and egress from Dealey Plaza, control the pursuit of any assassin, investigate themselves, and they had exclusive access and control of security for Oswald, thus allowing his murder in the basement of the police station. As to motive, the Dallas Police Department had a well-documented history of corruption and ties between a number of its officers with underworld figures such as local mob boss Joe Chivelo and strip joint owner and bagman Jack Ruby. Many officers were hostile to President Kennedy because of his Catholicism, while Kennedy stands for extending and protecting civil rights for African Americans, engendered outright hatred for more than a few officers who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. The Dallas police force contained not only a number of officers who belonged to an Army Reserve intelligence unit, many of whom were very conservative in their view, but also some extreme right-wing members of the John Birch Society who hated Kennedy for his refusal to invade Cuba, his firing of right-wing nut Army General Edwin Walker, and his peace overtures to the Soviet Union. Although the above could have been contributing factors, I believe the actual motivation was age-old. They did it for money. Police knew the route, President Kennedy's location, both in advance and in real time via radio. They had a clear line of sight killing zone in place for their shooter, and they had the crowds and thus any witnesses held back from their shooter's location. They controlled all vehicles coming into and leaving Dealey Plaza, to include the chaos of letting the traffic through the crime scene immediately after the murder. They investigated themselves and could pick up and destroy or hide any evidence. They and they alone controlled security for Oswald's transfer, and only they could have let Ruby in to kill and silence Oswald. The traffic officers and three-wheeled motorcycle officers who tested before the Warren Commission were selected by Captain Lawrence. So these cops had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to carry out this plan, and they did. But there's one thing they didn't have: the brains to plan it in the first place. But no plan is perfect. This plan to assassinate President Kennedy had 3 flaws. The first one was a minor one we covered in part 1, but the second and third were huge flaws that almost got them all caught. The first one was named Lee Oswald, a classic weak link, and the second, Jack Ruby. How do I know Ruby screwed up the whole plan? Because of the choice he was given. Kill Oswald and silence him and take a chance with the jury to atone for your screw-up, or die a very slow and painful death. In our final episode, number 8 to come, we'll examine the very sketchy behavior of Dallas County Sheriff Bill Decker and what may be the luckiest truck any assassin could have ever hoped for.